My name is Edward Brama, and we're here at the Brama Museum of Tea and Coffee by London Bridge. I recall more than 4 years ago, when I left the Royal Navy, I wanted to work in tropical agriculture. It could have been anything from bananas or sugar from the East to the West Indies, but in fact I chose to go into the tea business, and so I got a job as a planter of tea in Malawi, which 52 years ago was called Nyasaland in Central Africa near Mozambique. In the post-war period, the situation for employment was always very difficult. After 2 years, there was a very serious tea slump, and so I came back from Africa to London. I had such a varied experience. I think in the old days, one used to, on the plantation side, used to stay on a plantation for 5 or 6 years and then come back to the UK and have a holiday and then go back again on your second tour. But I found that by the time I was 25, I'd had 2 trips to Africa. I'd been with a major UK tea company, and I was very privileged to get a lot of information, a lot of knowledge fast, and I thought it was such an absorbing subject that I thought one day I would like to tell the story about tea and coffee in a museum.
And I found out about this place in a travel book, and I thought, because English people are very avid tea drinkers, they might have some decent tea served here on their afternoon tea, and also I want to learn about their tradition of tea.
And I came to this museum, a friend suggested that I came to have a look at it. I'd never even heard of it and I didn't know it existed, but I really enjoyed seeing the different teas and where it comes from. I didn't know that they compressed the tea down that a way to...
Проходили мимо, решил купить чашку. У меня традиция, я покупаю своей теще всегда чашку из разных стран, и сегодня получается английская. Сейчас шанс купить настоящее английское в Англии.
400 or 500 years ago, the world was round, and in the middle, the Pope in Italy had divided the world into two, but everything on the west could belong to the Spanish, whatever they discovered, and anything on the east belongs to the Portuguese. That explains why the Portuguese had a monopoly on the Far Eastern trade. The Portuguese were in search of God, gold and Cathay. They wanted the old China trade, the Marco Polo trade. And it was the Dutch who brought tea back from China and Japan via Batavia, Indonesia, to Holland in 1610. So the Dutch were drinking tea for 10, 20, 30, 40 years before the British. Then in 1652, they opened a little coffee house. A coffee house was opened in the city, in Cornhill. And the Dutch, incidentally, had created a pinnacle of elegance for making and serving tea. Coffee house that were serving coffee, chocolate and tea.
Do you have a favorite tea? I like Darjeeling and Earl Grey, the classics.
Earl Grey tea, it's the best.
My favourite would be with the black tea, a good Ceylon or a high quality Darjeeling, something like that.
Why the London people started to drink tea was because, if I can put it this way, in Madrid a few weeks ago, 200 people died at the World Trade Center, 3,000 people died the day before Christmas, 40,000 people died in Iran with an earthquake. But in London in 1665, 70,000 people died in the plague. That's 1 in 5 people died, and it must have been very, very, very frightening. But the next year, there was, of course, the big fire of London. There was nowhere for the children to play. And I'm sure that the women said to the fathers, take the children out to the new gardens which they're opening. The entrepreneurs were opening little gardens around the suburbs of London. And they said, look, the sun's out, go to the gardens, walk to the gardens, because you'll be getting away from the plague, you'll get fresh air. And of course, the idea was to enjoy yourself in the leisure gardens. And then people were tired when they got there, and they asked for the new drink from China, because because everybody knew that in order to make tea, you had to boil the water, so at least you didn't get typhoid. So you had a drink which was made with boiled water. And leisure gardens became so popular for drinking tea, all the gardens were known as the tea gardens. 85 tea gardens around London were all selling tea. Fashion for that came from Holland. The ladies were very happy to entertain in a very elegant way. In London, as London became more prosperous, we had, as you know, the development of our industrialisation and the creation of Manchester and Leeds and Sheffield and Birmingham, and all those industrial areas were producing wealth for the country. London became more prosperous, and they started to build houses in London and the London squares. And when they were building houses in the form of a terrace, every single house had the necessary implements, the equipage for making tea. They had tea kettles, they had tea pots, they had tea urns, they had tea milk, tea sugar bowls and tea bowls, tea plates, tea knives, tea saucers, everything for making tea, and a box, of course, a tea caddy. It was fashionable. Every single house virtually in London was drinking tea. But this was incredible because it took 1 year for the ships to go to China to get the tea, and 1 year or maybe 2 years to come back again. In the late 1700s, all these houses were enjoying and drinking tea. For 200 years, all our tea came from China. But from between 1850 and 1950, imports were established from India and Sri Lanka. And the tea was so good, the teas built all the British tea company. They built Mazawattee, they built Horniman's, they built Lipton's, they built Brook Bond, they built Typhoon, they built Tetley's, they built Ridgway's and the Cooperative. All the British tea companies were built on the back of Indian and Ceylon tea. And the Indian tea was so thick and smooth and malty that it was just a delectable, delicious drink. The Ceylon teas were equally superb, and there was always something happening in the tea business. You know, there was the new ceramics which were developed in Stoke-on-Trent, Minton, Spode, Wedgwood, all those factories up in Staffordshire making new designs for teawares, and the fashion for tea. There was the social etiquette of drinking tea and entertaining your neighbour. Well, coffee came first, actually, in the coffee houses, but to make coffee, you had to have roast the beans, and that created an aroma of coffee, which was very nice, but it was very hard work to roast the beans. You had to learn how to roast beans. Coffee was more difficult to make, and you can't really sell two things at once, and it was the tea that became fashionable. Chinese knew for 3,000–4,000 years that tea was good for you. And everybody in the UK stopped for the tea break. Everybody accepted that tea was a good, healthy drink to have.
I have about 5 cups a day. It's a British institution, drinking tea. I don't drink coffee because it's too much caffeine, but I drink tea, but I regulate it. In the morning I drink caffeine-free tea. Then I have an ordinary cup of tea, then another caffeine-free tea, and then in the evening another ordinary cup of tea.
With pleasure, I'm delighted to show you how we make the traditional pot of English tea. Of course, we have to heat this pot because if you feel it at the moment, it's cold, so we have to heat the pot by just pouring a little hot water in. And we just let that go through, and then we throw that away. If I'm making tea for two, it's one for you, one for me, and one for the pot. And the tea coming to the boil. Give it a little stir. Now Now we will let this tea infuse for 5 minutes. And that 5 minutes is the heart and the soul and the essence of traditional English tea, because it was the moment when the madam of the house, she could talk to her friends who would come in for tea. She could talk to the children to ask, what were you doing this morning, what are you going to do this afternoon. It was the moment of conversation, full of etiquette and procedure for English afternoon tea, which we had copied from the Dutch, and the Dutch had copied from the Japanese, and the Japanese had copied from the Chinese. And to serve the tea, you may remember the milk will go in first as part of this, because that way you don't burn it, and we pour the tea. This is a very delicate Darjeeling tea that I have here. And in 2 minutes I will have a sip of my tea, and I will enjoy it.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All the best. Drink the tea.